Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our Belmas Leadership Preparation and Development Research Interest Group. This is a special research interest group meeting because we had one a couple of weeks ago, and I can see we're joined by Suzanne now too. Hi, Suzanne. So Suzanne's one of the co-conveners of the LPD RIG. Great to have you with us. We've just got people still joining us. So for the people who are just on your way in, we have decided to record the discussion so that we can put it on the Belmas website. Okay, so I'm going to move swiftly on and I'm going to introduce you to Lizana and to Derek, and they've got a presentation on their book, so they're going to start with that. In the meantime, Rianne's very kindly put her details in the chat, so if you'd like to introduce yourselves to each other and put your details in the chat, and if you want to put email addresses in so you can get in touch with each other afterwards, feel free to do that. That doesn't go out when the recording goes out. Okay. Over to you, Lizana, Derek.
Thanks, Deb. And Derek, do you want to start us off by introducing yourself?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Derek Boyle. I am a skit director, so I run initial teacher training for a skit based in Bromley in southeast London. What do I do? I qualified as a physics teacher back in 1996. I worked as a physics and chemistry, biology, and various other subjects teaching for 17 years. Ended up as an assistant head teacher with an interest in mentoring and coaching and professional development, and in particular, mentoring being used as a developmental tool for staff rather than being a stick to beat people with, which was some of the approaches which some SLT I was working with used. Last 11 years, I've been running Bromley Schools Collegiate, and during that time, I've been involved with IPDA, Belmas, BERA. I've done some work for the Fabians. I've sort of been rolling around sort of the ITT world for quite a while. 2 years ago, I did a MA at University of East London. Lizana was my dissertation supervisor, and we did a lot of work on mentoring and coaching. And I got the good news last week. I've been unconditionally accepted to start a PhD with Lizana as one of my supervisors at University of Wolverhampton. So it's all very exciting and shiny at the moment in my world. Lots of things going on. And of course, a lovely book, which I've had a great chance to chat to people about mentoring and coaching. So there we go.
That's great. Thanks, Derek. And I think you've forgotten to mention that we met each other being founding trustees of NUSBIT as well.
Oh,
so
yeah, that as well.
Our journey goes a long way, doesn't it? And it's been really exciting to work with Derek on these various different, journeys that he's been on. But just a little bit about myself. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Wolverhampton, and I've been really fortunate and privileged to work on the MA, and particularly focusing on the international MA, where we also teach a module on coaching and mentoring as well as then leadership. And I also program lead the MPQs at the university as well as the early careers framework. So we spend quite a lot of plates, Derek and I, and what we were trying to do was with this book try to pull together all our experience over time, and also then trying to think about a book that could have helped us and assisted us in our journey when we developed as leaders, but also when we developed others in similar roles. So that's very much what inspired the book, and hopefully it will help people to take other people by the hand to enable them to be successful on their journeys. And similar to Derek, I have also directed a skit and supported with a training school. So a lot of synergies there, but also lots of other things that we do. And together, hopefully, the book could potentially help people in future to move things forward. Great. So Derek, we have a presentation, and
Yep.
I'll pop it up, and then if you, as per usual, walk us through it, and then I'll chip in if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, happy to.
Lovely.
Right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. This book became a bit of a journey. So a bit of a cliche, that one, but we wanted to write a book as if we was talking to ourselves 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago, looking back with what I wish I'd known at the time, and working up through schools in England. You get promoted into a role, then you work out what you've got to do with that role, then work out the agency and the latitude which you've got with it. If you are then also taking your teams with you, we are looking at how we can develop people who grow up through the same organisation with same cultural values, for example, or those which are coming in to an organisation. And it's not tied to a particular theoretical framework. It's not tied to a particular theoretical view about what mentoring and coaching should be or shouldn't be. It's more of a case of providing the reader with a toolkit where they can start thinking about how you can support and inspire and nurture talent within organizations. All the way from if you're working with trainee teachers and early career professionals, all the way through to head teachers, with also additional chapters working with BAME leaders or global majority leaders, and also with women into, particularly in leadership, with the work that Lizana's done for years around women's ed, and in particular.
That's great. Thanks, Derek. And I think even though we're saying that we don't subscribe to a particular model of coaching, what we do subscribe to is that we are clear on the definitions of what coaching is and what mentoring is. And with that, then we reflect very carefully on how we need to consider when to coach and when to mentor. And our main argument of the book is, or in the book, is that we are arguing that we need to understand the needs of the person we are working with to enable us then to know how to move on that continuum of coaching and mentoring, to have a real sense of how to meet the needs of that person. For us, it's more important to have the tools in your pocket and to know how well to execute those tools. In particular, if you were to frame any conversation around a particular model, you need to know why you're using it, how you're going to utilize it, and how you'll meet the needs of the person in front of you. And for us, that was the key underpinning of every chapter and everything we've discussed within the book.
Yeah, and thanks for that. And it's understanding the challenges which you've got as a mentor, the person who you may be mentoring, and to see it as a developmental opportunity for both people. When I come out of any mentoring or coaching conversation I have with colleagues, whether they're trainees or whether they are deputy head teachers who's struggling with how to approach a situation with a weak member of staff, having that reflexive practice, looking at, well, how did I feel at the end of that conversation, and what have I learned about my own practice as a result of doing this, is a key part of I know my own practice. But what we've done is, wherever people's potential career trajectory is taking them, we wanted to give within the chapters an opportunity for the reader to stop, pause, and reflect. At this point, after this particular section, how can we get people to look critically at their own practice? What would I do if? So it's around ideas with things like scenario-based learning, or sometimes sort of dilemma coaching. And another thing which we wanted to do was to realize that if you are mentoring within an organization or providing coaching opportunities within an organization, it's about the other facilitated support which you can draw upon, and not seeing that you need to be the expert. You are the one person contracting or being contracted within this relationship with the person you're mentoring or coaching, that recognizing you may not have the answers, and as a mentor and a coach, you shouldn't have the answers. You are there helping them to develop into a reflective practitioner themselves wherever they are.
Lovely. And I think what's really important to us is also to emphasize the importance that people need to make that shift from reflection into reflexive practice. And we explore that in quite a bit of detail, where we sort of unpack the need where, as Dewey says, behavior is a manifestation of our beliefs, and we need to confront those beliefs sometimes and challenge our thinking through our learning, through our engagement with research, through our engagement with our wider reading, to then think about how we need to address those beliefs, which then results in behavioral changes and sustainable behavioral changes that we want to see over time. And that is why it's important to understand what's the difference between mentoring and coaching. And mentoring might, develop you to be really reflective in your practice, thinking in and on practice, reflecting in and on practice, as Sean is saying in his work. However, we want to go deeper with that thinking, and that's where coaching comes in, where it facilitates your thinking, where it gets you to dig deep, to find the solutions within yourself, but also to look beyond that and also find ways to address things in a meaningful way. So for us, that was really, really important, and it really aligns then with our position on the coach and the mentor, engaging with learning relationships with the coach or coachee, and also the learning relationships that will enable them to flourish. I think that's really vital for us. And that is also why we wanted to acknowledge the different trajectories, but also then the different communities that we work within in education, and how learning looks differently for each one of those, because Connor and Pecora pointed out, sort of highlights it nicely, where they say coaching and mentoring can be defined as learning relationships, and we need to hold people within those learning relationships in a supportive way. So for us, there were key messages in the book that we wanted to get across, and then also provide people with helpful, supportive outlines of how they can draw on some of the tools we recommend and also some of the guidance we recommend. So, Derek, do you want to talk us through that?
Yeah, one of the things that we wanted to do was that it wasn't tied to a particular sort of methodology or a particular qualification. So it wasn't specifically written for people undertaking MPQs. It wasn't specifically written for people taking master's degrees. It was written as an opportunity, somebody that can pick up on it, prompt their thinking, and get them to reflect and deepen their practice. We've got the research informed definitions, and we can take those through, and you've got the wider reading which people can undertake. But we've got the reflective questions which we ask the reader to have a look at and reflect on. But also we've got a good number of case studies through where the impact of the right mentoring and coaching at the right time for those people have helped them to grow and flourish and develop, perhaps in unforeseen ways. And those conversations then leading on to communities of practice and opportunities for collaborative professionalism between small and nucleating groups of mentors and coaches and mentees and coaches. And eventually what we like is that good practice and wisdom to be passed on, so you then grow capacity within organization or a professional learning community. And if we can link those professional learning communities together, then we can add capacity to the whole system in terms of effective mentoring and coaching.
Absolutely. And so we argue, don't we, Derek, that we want to move away from these misconceptions and also potential stigmas that's attached to coaching and mentoring, where it's often used, in performative situations and also compliance situations. But we are arguing that actually coaching and mentoring needs to be part of your development toolkit, as well as your support toolkit in terms of your well-being. And that is why it's so important to understand how you can utilize it to help you to shape your own journey, but also to support you on that journey to move your learning forward as a professional learner. And the case studies demonstrate that. And we were also very keen to give voice to colleagues in the profession to illustrate how they use it, but also new colleagues to then this this landscape, to hear some new voices in terms of how they execute coaching and mentoring in their daily practice. So you will hear from people like, for example, Krupa Patel, who's someone who works very closely with me at BayMed. And of course, Derek, you have also included some of your colleagues from your partnership that you work with in your skit.
Yeah, and one of them in particular, Mary Davis, who actually came through as a trainee teacher through our skit 10, 11 years ago, and seeing how she's grown through being a supervising teacher, a mentor, and then providing local training to trainee teachers now. So she's gone through those processes going through, and it's about nurturing talent and seeing mentoring as an opportunity for that continuing professional learning and development within an organization, as it being an agent for change, and retaining those ideas and concepts around teacher agency, because it really struck me when I was reflecting on when I was writing the book. As an assistant head teacher, I had one of my departmental teams that had an external review, and there was seen to be some weak teaching. And I remember my line manager coming to me and saying, go and do some coaching for a couple of weeks, and that will sort his teaching out. Then sitting down and sort of explain to him that you cannot drive somebody to change and that to be sustained within 2 weeks. It's a longitudinal relationship. And he said, but I've got someone else that needs coaching to improve their training as well, their teaching as well. And I'm going, it's not the way it works. And it's about a longitudinal relationship where you've got to build up trust, to build up the agency of the person you're working with, so they can make those changes themselves and they can sustain them over time. And when I told him that's gonna take 5 to 6 months, he looked absolutely horrified. Says, but I need these teachers to improve their teaching. Then you need to invest in them. You don't need to beat them. And that's where that idea about moving, that mentoring and coaching should be as a developmental tool for the individual, but also for teams. And if we can build capacity across teams, you then do get that true self-improving situation, that if everyone is willing to mentor and coach other people on other aspects of their practice, whether it's peer-to-peer, whether it's you've got a new middle leader and you provide capacity within your organization for example, peer coaching, a more experienced other who can then provide that support when that new post holder needs it or wants it, rather than saying, right, you will be coached on a Wednesday, period 4, no matter what else is going on, that's when you're going to do it, and that's your 4-week induction to being a new middle leader. It doesn't work like that in the real world. And this is where sometimes we need to break down those preconceptions that it's a performative tool. You've had your coaching, therefore you are now a better middle leader. Sorry, that's just a personal bugbear from my prior job.
Interesting reflection there, and thanks for sharing, Derek. And I think that it sort of aligns with what we are saying in the book. We look at the Dreyfus model in particular, where we explore then the different stages of development for educators and teachers. We started novice all the way through to mastery. And I was thinking today, as I was watching the news, there was an announcement that one of the most decorated female athletes was retiring as an Olympian. And it takes years to become an Olympian, years, a long, long time. She engaged in 3 Olympics and then decided, she's not going to move on to the Paris Olympics and would focus on her family. And that's absolutely fantastic. But I thought what's really interesting for me as someone who developed teachers and used coaching and mentoring as a tool is that what's really interesting in the sector is that we want people to be developed within seconds to become outstanding. Whereas if we look at an Olympian, it could take up to 5 years to get to Olympics level. And that means they've had a really strong foundation as an athlete, and they've been an elite athlete for a significant period of time. But when it comes to a profession like teaching, which is highly complex, we expect someone to be stepping out within 2 years and be outstanding and do a fantastic job. And I think that it's really important that we consider where a person is at, meet them at that point, develop that relationship of trust, and over time develop that agency and engagement with what we need to do with them to enable them to be the best they can be for the children they support. But also, when you become a leader, you again have that identity shift where you become a novice leader, and you need that support in place to enable you to move from that novice phase to then the best you can be over time. And it doesn't happen overnight. And I think that's an important point for us to make, especially when we get to that point where we have tensions between the drive for excellence in schools and, again, what does it mean to develop as a professional? And that's where mentoring and coaching and that continuum comes into play to enable us then to support people in a meaningful way, but also to enable us to make people feel safe within our context, to open up to learning, and also then seeing this as a really valuable profession, because in my view, you know, teaching is always and has always been the best job in the world. I wouldn't train teachers if I didn't believe that. And we believe that coaching and mentoring can make a real empowering difference if it's utilized to meet the needs of others rather than it becoming something else. And having a toolkit in your pocket and continuing to grow as a coach and a mentor is really vital. And my own doctoral research is very much about how do we develop coaches and mentors. And with that, I also argue that it needs to be a scaffolded approach. It needs to be cyclical or spiral curriculum, but within that we also need to build in pockets of supervision to provide support for coaches and mentors to enable them to have the necessary support. So there's a lot to think about, but also I think hopefully the book will start the debate and continue that conversation to enable people then to see how it can be used in a meaningful way within different contexts. I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to open this up then for further conversation. And I think, Deb, do you want to step in at this point?
We've touched on an awful lot there through that presentation. Thank you very much, both of you. But really what we've been talking about is how our potentially performative culture kind of hide bounds the way in which the constraining ways in which mentoring and coaching are currently being developed, aren't they? The way in which we're seeing it run out. So for those of you who are international on the call today, we have two big pieces of kind of policy direction inside England specifically, and we have very different systems in other parts of the UK. But particularly our core content framework on our initial teachers, and following on from that, our early career framework, which the government very recently merged to create our ITTE ECF framework, are kind of putting very performative expectations onto something which those of us who've been involved in both mentoring and coaching for long periods of time probably feel are not very helpful. So, you know, there are benefits of a 2-year early career framework, for example, in comparison to the year in terms of that supportive nature of the way we support our early career entrants. But a lot of us can see a lot of the downsides that kind of go along with that. But I think you've both touched on a huge amount here for people to discuss. And I think that was really useful, particularly when people rewatch it. Thank you. How do you all feel? Would you like us to stop the recording there so that you can talk more freely, or are you happy to have your conversation recorded? What do you think? Feel free to give some ideas. Derek, I can see you've taken your mic off.
I just hadn't switched it off again.
Okay.
So my cat's in the other room. Yeah, I'm quite happy for it to carry on being recorded. It's just how colleagues want to feel. Okay, so we'll carry on recording then. We don't often do this in our meetings. We usually stop the recording so that people can talk, but I think it's useful for people to hear people's opinions. But just then a proviso, if you're talking, be aware that you're being recorded, and that will be going onto the website. So lots and lots and lots to talk about. Who would like to kick us off?
maybe Deb, if I could just say something about the various frameworks, if that helps. Derek and I were very stubborn. We were deliberate in not interweaving the frameworks as is at the moment. We wanted to look at the principles rather than write to what the current policies are sort of dictating or suggesting, because we wanted the book to be transferable in different contexts. And in particular, as you mentioned, the ITT market review, as well as then now the merged core content framework stroke ECF, because as you can see already, the policy changed. So if we were to write to that, we would have been in a position where we probably would need to edit the book every 5 minutes, because policy changes so regularly and often in England. So we thought, actually, we are going to look at the core elements and components of coaching and mentoring rather than, be over fixated on policy changes, if that makes sense.
I think also I'd be quite interested, for sort of different contexts about, because I was quite keen that you could translate what was written in the different chapters into the rest of the countries within the United Kingdom, but also broader as well. And I can see we've got some Canadian colleagues here as well, and I'll be really interested in what the cultural context of mentoring and coaching in other countries are, because I get a sense of that a little bit through like IPDA, International Professional Development Association, but I'll be really interested in the transferability.
Yes, and as you know, probably because you've done a bit of review work with me through the International Journal for Mentoring and Coaching with Andy Hobson, where we have seen quite interesting practice right across the board internationally, but in particular in Australia as well. There is a lot of interest in how coaching and mentoring can work to support teachers, and there's a lot of work done there as well. So we wanted the book to be positioned more broadly in that sense as well. Are there any questions from anyone?
I was trying not to come to Tina straight away in terms of somebody from the but happily you've put your hand up anyway, so that solves the problem.
Yeah. Part of my personality, when there's sort of that dead air, you can guarantee that Tina's going to jump in. But seeing how you spoke about the international context, I'll jump in on that cue. So I can speak first from my experience as a school leader myself here, but then also part of my portfolio or my my tenures has also been with our professional organization and supporting teachers in the province of New Brunswick. And in particular, my role was in support of leadership. So looking at coaching in the province of New Brunswick, I certainly could relate to what was said earlier in terms of the negative connotations that sort of develop for teachers who are encouraged or asked or directed to engage in a coaching session. Normally it does come because there is an identified area of growth or an identified crisis or problem. So that does exist here. In terms of policy, there isn't anything specifically written down. The other, I guess, thing that's resonated with me when I was listening to you talk about this particular book and this toolkit, which I think is fantastic, is that here in New Brunswick, we would oftentimes direct coaching events to outside the school itself. So our local regional areas or our districts are set up with coaches and mentors that work specifically in subject areas. So oftentimes our administrators might be overseeing a coaching or a mentoring event, but they're not engaged in it themselves per se. Sometimes that's because they don't have expertise in the subject area in some of our larger high schools, for example, right? How could would a administrator with an English background be well equipped to sort of coach or mentor the chemistry teacher, which leads to what you did speak about is how it can really be detrimental to the relationship that an administrator has with their teaching staff, because it's when a teacher cannot manage a classroom that an administrator is stepping in a coaching capacity. The only other observation that I would have made here, and this is my personal opinion, in the whole coaching is oftentimes what I do believe is part of the mandate, and an understood part of the mandate here in New Brunswick, is that a principal would coach their vice principal. I don't know if that's helpful at all, but I was curious if in your work, if you did see a difference in perhaps an international context, and whether or not it's geared towards academics or if it's geared towards behavior in terms of the type of coaching that's taking place.
I think you've thanks for that, team. That's really interesting to hear. The direct line management, if there is coaching going on within a line management relationship, there is always a power dynamic. And that's why one of the things we argue for in the book is within organisations. So it might be at a district level, you alluded to it, that there is a bank or a resource of external coaches, and that it's seen as a part of a developmental entitlement when somebody goes into role, to help them to develop and grow into that role. Because otherwise you've always got, can I really open up and say I'm not very confident doing A, because I've got to report outcomes on A to the very person who is coaching me. And within those power dynamics, you will get a closing down if you're working with somebody externally. I personally fall free. I've got somebody outside of my organisation that acts in a coaching role with me. There are certain things I will talk to my line manager about, and there are certain things I won't, because there is always that power dynamic. And that's one of the things we argue about, having this bank of external expertise, and sometimes even from outside your organisation, particularly at a coaching side. If you're looking more at a subject specific mentoring, for example, I'm a physics teacher by training, so when my trainee teachers come to me, and if they're a science specialist, I can do quite in-depth subject specific mentoring with them on aspects of their practice and moving that to a coaching relationship. If I'm working with my English trainees, there is a slightly different relationship, because it's also whether you feel personally qualified to have a mentoring conversation. If it's with my English trainees, I would tend to have more of a coaching style conversation with them. And so it's realizing if it's a mentoring relationship, where the breadth of your expertise that you can help them to develop, or whether you need to look at more of a coaching relationship or find someone else that can provide that support. But then you're looking at organizational capacity, which is an area of research I'm particularly interested in.
So I'm just going to come to Peter, because he's got a question in the chat that he wanted to ask you. And actually, Derek, what you've done, and then we'll come to Steph after that. And actually, Derek, what you've done is started to answer his question. So do you want to ask your question out loud so that people know what it is, Peter? Thank you.
Yes, certainly. Good afternoon, morning, whatever time it is for everyone around the world. Yeah, I'm actually doing a bit of research in my master's at the moment about coaching and mentoring, and one of the things that I have found is, and I'm listening to it here, is that coaching and mentoring seem to be mentioned in the same breath, almost as if they're the same thing. And certainly my research indicates they're very, very, very distinctly different. And Derek, you just alluded to that. And I'm just intrigued to make sure that we have a definition, because I think that if you don't define what coaching is, and you can slip in and out of coaching and mentoring, and they're distinct, and they're distinct business lines. They have distinct outcomes, and I think it's wrong to say that everybody can be a coach, and it's wrong to say everyone can be a mentor. But I think you alluded to it earlier on, that Derek, is that you tend to be an expert as a mentor, and a coach can come from anywhere. and certainly the coaching training I had as an educator came from a business coach, because the skills are universal. He doesn't need to be an expert in my field to elicit the best out of me. But I just think that I personally think there needs to be clarity between the two. And my last point, which I'm going to throw in there, because one of the things that I think is really, really powerful as an educator is what I call advice given by a friend or a colleague over a cup of coffee. And I want to, I'm exploring at the moment how powerful that advice has been on people's careers over and above mentoring or coaching, because I think that they're not often that lack of power dynamic that you mentioned is removed, and colleagues who've maybe trodden the same ground, a similar path, can give really sound advice, which has tremendous impact, whether that be on classroom behaviour or indeed your career. So sorry, there's quite a lot there, but I think just clarity on what we're talking about is perhaps important.
I'll pass this one to Lizana.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. Yeah, we do actually clearly define coaching and mentoring. It's a really valuable point, important point to make. And I did say that in the presentation as well. We work with clear definitions, mentoring them being taking someone by the hand, giving advice, guidance, feedback, whereas coaching is a non-judgmental, non-directive engagement with someone where the coachee drives the journey, and we work with the coachee to enable them to find the solutions within themselves to make the most of their talents. So we're very clear on that, and that's why we make the point that it's important to understand the needs of that person to enable us then to know when to coach or when to mentor. And it's key, if you look at the guidance by the European Mentoring Coaching Council or the International Coaching Federation, they're very clear that we need to be clear on those definitions when we contract with a person. And you would say to them, you know, I can be your coach. This is how coaching works, and this is how we will engage with each other. So it's really ethically important to actually have that clear line with individuals that you work with. And I would also go as far as saying, Peter, that in my view, I think coaches and mentors need to be trained and developed really well to know the distinct difference, but also to know the nuances of the work, and to know how to also work between the different models and the different tools in the toolkit to really be able to do it justice. And I don't even want to subscribe to the idea that anyone can be a coach, because I think that, you know, coaches need to be really, really well developed and skilled to be able to hold those conversations in a meaningful way, to be able to unpack the thinking really carefully, and to enable that person to progress positively and purposefully, and to continue to flourish. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Yeah.
And I've just picking up that point you said about the conversations over a coffee. We tend to sort of think of those within my organisation as sort of informal peer coaching and mentoring, which is a sort of a fancy way of saying seeking advice over a cuppa. But that's the way where people they're testing the water, and it's almost that sort of the validation that my thinking is aligned, it's along the same lines, so that people can test out that sort of emotional response. And sometimes some of the best bits of advice which I got was from other teachers who may be sort of a year ahead of where I am, but also what I've learned from working with trainee teachers myself. I've learned so much from them, from those sort of informal conversations.
It's a co-constructive nature of it, isn't it? And Rachel Loftus actually is doing a piece, or has been doing a piece, on staff room conversations as well, and the value of those as informal peer mentoring exercises and opportunities to enable people to progress and grow. So there's some research in the pipeline, I'm sure, because I know she's presented on it at one of the conferences I've been at. So watch that space.
Lovely. Thanks very much, both of you. So we're coming to Steph, and then we'll come to you, Anna May, after Steph, if that's okay. And we've got some extra people coming in, so that's nice that people have been dipping in and out. Steph.
Hi, Deborah. Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. Lizana, you've started to answer this question anyway, but I work in a very similar field for you as you do, and my role is very similar to what you've described for your own role at Newcastle University. And one of the things that I encounter a lot with teacher leaders and ITT specialists and so on is that there's a basic understanding that coaching and mentoring are slightly different from each other and that they can be quite powerful tools in professional development, but there's significant inexpertise in both skill sets. And what you've just said about how important it is to understand and to really have that skill set well developed, I think is very important. And this book seems to me to be probably quite a timely tool, and it might be part of your answer to the question, but I wonder how you see developing that expertise within the education sector so that we don't have inexpert and in some cases possibly quite harmful advice giving masked as mentoring or coaching that isn't really happening in the way that a skilled professional would want it to happen.
That's a big question.
Yeah, sorry.
No.
You have time to think if you want.
My lifelong obsession. And I completely agree with you. I think it's really about reimagining that space and thinking carefully about it. And I know what you're alluding to as well. In some of the models that's creeping in, where it's referred to as coaching and it's about instruction, meaning teaching and learning coaching. It sometimes isn't. It's directive, and it is very specific. Compared to what coaching really is about. So, and I'm happy to critique that because it's been critiqued and debated in the House of Lords as well. It's gone as far as that, and I think that, you know, first of all, I think we need to amplify and raise the profile of mentoring and coaching within teaching and education, which is helpful because even though we don't want to sort of overemphasize the policies that you know are currently in place, what was helpful was that the early careers framework did point out that coaching and mentoring can be a helpful tool. It elevated that position of coaching and mentoring as then something to move on with. But I think within schools, what's really important is to have this as a valuable role. The first time I applied for a promotion in school was because I wanted to be a mentor, and it was coupled with a head of Key Stage 4 role. And the thing that really attracted me was the mentoring job, and I'll say this now, many years later, but it was a recognized role within the school, and therefore I had permission to have time off my timetable to do the role justice. I had training in place, and that happened regularly and often. And I was incredibly lucky that the school invested in that same way for coaches and mentors to work with initial teacher trainees as well as then in QTs. And this was in 2004. So they had the sort of vision to really develop in that way. But, you know, the school also embraced then becoming a skit and so on. And I think that that's a really important thing to do is we have to acknowledge it as a role. And we need to acknowledge that time is required, so there needs to be a time budget in place. But then again, with the development part, that, you know, episodic training is not going to enable people to become experts in this field. If you look at the requirements for EMCC, for example, or ICF, there is a requirement that people engage with X amount of hours of conducting coaching and mentoring, as well as then evidence their training. I think we need to expect the same level of engagement and commitment in that way. But as I've said, with my own doctoral research, what came out of that was also the support for mentors and coaches through supervision is an important additional support. And that will enable us then not only to create a culture where we have coaching and mentoring in place as a support mechanism, a developmental tool, but also as an actual role and as an actual, you know, pathway into what we need to do to enable others. And I think with that then comes that opportunity for development and that longitudinal development that's required to become incredibly good at this, to be a master at your profession and your skills, to help others to flourish. And I think that for me is probably the ideal. And I know it will remain an ideal until we get that support. But we need to start small and somewhere and have those conversations. And hopefully this book will enable people to have those conversations and continue to think more creatively about how this could happen. Does that answer your question, Steph?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I think,
Anna May
yeah,
next, yes.
yeah, I'm going to come in. Thank you, Derek and Lizana and Deborah too. And I'm really enjoying the conversation. And you know, I'm just hugely interested in mentoring and coaching, particularly Peter's point that they are, you know, used interchangeably, both mentoring and coaching. And I believe, for what it's worth, that it's important for educational systems to actually help here. We've spoken an awful lot about the individual coaches and individual mentors and their responsibilities so that their relationships with who they work with are very clear. But in Ireland, what we have done is very briefly developed formal mentoring for newly appointed principals and coaching for all principals. And the formal mentoring for the newly appointed principals comes from their peers who are just a little bit more experienced than them, but we emphasize the reciprocal piece of the relationship. And the coaching is from external coaches outside of teaching and education, which has proved to be a really good approach. So I suppose my point is that it is up to education systems to distinguish between mentoring and coaching and to make sure that the people in them know exactly what they're signing up to. And just one other interesting thing before I stop is that the mentoring has been highly successful, and somewhere like 60% of the people who are training as mentors now were previous mentees themselves. The coaching, there are 4,000 school heads in Ireland, and of those, only about 1,800 have actually, you know, gone for the coaching, even though it's free of charge and been available since 2017. So I just thought you might find that interesting. So I don't have a question as such, but I'm just wondering what you feel around the, I suppose, the importance of the education systems in our various jurisdictions being clear on what coaching and mentoring is. Thanks a million, folks.
Thank you. It's a really interesting observation that only a handful of, well, a small number of head teachers took up the offer, isn't it? But it shows us, I would suppose, how it's valued. And I think that we need to do more on amplifying its values so that it becomes part of the culture, because of the misconception of what coaching and mentoring is and what it does. It's often seen as someone who's not coping or not doing well that would be mentored or coached, and it might well be that's the reason why they're not picking up on it. But a different conversation needs to be explored there with them to see how it can enable them. But yes, a really interesting observation. I agree with you. I think we need to be clear on what it is that we offer, how it will help, and also then our definitions being clearer to enable us to facilitate better. Derek, I don't know if you have anything else.
Yeah, just a quick anecdote. We recently had a visit from our ITT inspection service, Ofsted, and I remember sitting with the lead inspector saying, "Well, we've seen 3 mentoring meetings between the mentors and the trainees. One was using a mentoring approach, one was using a coaching approach, and one was using a mentoring and then went into a coaching approach. How do you account for this variability?" I said, "Because that was probably what the trainee needed at that point."
Yeah, I think, but again, that needs to be theoretically underpinned, isn't it, Eric? And if you look at some of the research around that, Christian van Nieuwenberg's work is really interesting. He talks about the continuum of coaching and mentoring, knowing when to coach, when to mentor, asking permission and recontracting to be able to do that. So you don't just automatically do it, you check in with the person to do it. And that's what I mean by you have to be really well trained on both of those sets of skills and knowing how to ethically mitigate that, and then to meet the needs of the person appropriately. But I think, you know, there's a lot of research around it. Jim Knight works in this space as well. And also, if you look at Andy Buck's book, The Basic Coaching Method, he talks again about knowing how to move on that continuum appropriately. So there's a few that you can look up on in terms of that, but there's a lot of thinking around it in terms of meeting needs. And I think that's the important thing. We need to meet the person's needs in front of us, because if we ask an awful lot of questions and they're not ready for them, and they're not at that stage, and that's where the Dreyfus model comes in. Let's say they're a novice at this, they don't know what they don't know. The amount of questions might push them in a limbic response that might be flight, fight, or freeze, and they might not be open to learning. Similarly, if we have someone who's a master and we tell them everything we know and we take them by the hand, that wouldn't be particularly useful for them either. So it's knowing where that person is at and knowing how we can navigate that journey for them appropriately to offer the right amount of support and challenge to enable them to flourish. And I think that's the key here when we think about coaching and mentoring, and is knowing how these nuanced approaches work to meet those needs, to really develop leaders in the most appropriate way, or the new teacher. I think, Nadal, I think you were first, and then Tracy, and then Tina. I've just noticed Deb had to step out for a few minutes. Oh no, she is still here. Sorry, Deb. But if you're happy to go in that order, that's absolutely fine.
Hi, I'm happy to wait if someone else has their
No,
hand.
you were next.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. That was very helpful and useful, especially in the context of my current research. I apologize if my question was answered or commented on, because I've popped out of the session for about 10 minutes, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So when I listened to your and Derek's conversation, I thought about, like, maybe now we're looking at some kind of an advanced form of research or practice in mentoring and coaching, whereas my current research on educational leadership learning and practice in Iraq has shown that school leaders speak about being mentored by the former head teacher, but they don't have any kind of formal practice of mentoring in their experience. So I kind of try to understand the formalization and structuralization of mentoring in that context, but apparently they see it as something really important and useful, and it contributed to a significant part of their understanding and learning. However, it hasn't been in any way formalized. I don't know if that makes sense to you. What do you think about that informal form of mentoring, knowing that you have been researching it and you have already a lot of experience with structured mentoring?
I think in terms of the informal mentoring, as long as it comes from a position of mutual respect, and there is no sort of power dynamic in it, and that informal mentoring give an opportunity for people to open up and to test ideas in perhaps in an unstructured way, to then perhaps be the seed for future conversations along a similar sort of lines. And you can, one of the things I asked some of my trainee teachers to do, and also new mentors, is to keep a reflective diary about how their thoughts and on their own practice develops. So, but not as sort of like a formal journaling approach, but more of a case of an opportunity to collect thoughts and then to bring those thoughts perhaps to a future meeting.
Thank you.
That's all right.
I think just in terms of informal mentoring, there's a lot of value in that. In business, for example, if you look at some of the research in business, the actual approach there is sometimes that you seek your own mentor and you approach someone and ask them to be your mentor, and almost in a way your sponsor, to look after you and to guide you and to nurture you. And I think there are different types of mentors, and I think, you know, in that context, it sounds to me like, you know, the head teacher is almost that person who tells the person everything they need to know, and also gives them guidance and advice where questions come up, and also point them in the right direction in terms of potential opportunities or whatever else might happen. And I think that's quite a natural flow of things in some cases. As long as, you know, it's a mutually agreed situation and it's co-constructive and meaningful, and there's a real sense of learning that takes place, it can be incredibly valuable. I have had an informal mentor all my life, Harry Dodds. I started with him as someone who coordinated initial teacher training course, and almost everything I did on my journey was advised by Harry and supported, and later on he also collaborated with me and worked with me at the Skid where I was director at, and that was a hugely beneficial relationship for both of us, and we benefited massively from it. So I think it depends on how it's, you know, how it comes about, but it can be very successful as well. And you know, in my case, I can't thank him enough for what he has done to get me to where I am at the moment, and you know, and hopefully beyond this point. But I think, you know, there is value in that as well, and it's a very under-researched area in education, but it'd be interesting to look at how it could work. Tracy and then Tina.
Thanks, Lizana.
And Tracy, can I just say something before you ask your question? Just many congratulations on your lovely outcome. I saw the photos. Tracy passed her Viva. Many congratulations, and so pleased for you. You just need to unmute.
Sorry, I thought I had done it. So I'm coming from a governance perspective in an English secondary school. And I really resonate with what you said, Derek, about the whole performativity tool. If someone isn't performing, then they'll do that. In the current climate in education, especially in schools where it's so busy and there is so much put on performance and tables, the idea of coaching and mentoring is lovely. And I know that we do it for the early years teachers because we have to. But if it's not measured, or if it's not put in the frameworks, we have to do it. Do you feel that then that may not happen because of time constraints, because of everyone's so busy? And I noticed, I was quite interested by Anna, what you were saying about Ireland, how there is time and resources put in place, and some head teachers haven't taken that up. And I wonder if that's, maybe there isn't, they don't feel there is time, or it's not valued enough because there isn't enough evidence to show how it's useful. So I just wondered how you saw that. I think you've already acknowledged some of that. And also the other question, I wanted to ask about governance and how you saw coaching and mentoring in terms of governance.
I knew you would ask that. It's a bit of a chicken and egg situation in terms of coaching and mentoring at the moment. I almost want to argue that sometimes when coaching and mentoring is not fully developed and you know, embedded within a context, the value of it is not perceived in the same way either. So we need to work on that, but and work on the development of cultures within schools where it is valued but also utilized well, and then build in within that an accountability piece rather than a performativity piece, where it doesn't just become a paper pushing exercise but actually a learning exercise. So it's about starting small in a meaningful way and really work with. I found the projects I've worked on, I worked with staff for staff rather than from the top down, where it mushroomed in the organization and where people saw it as learning conversations and talking about teaching and learning, where collaborative professionalism could happen. So it's about thinking how that could work and how we can do it from the front line up onwards and give people agency to do that, and start at the grassroots, if you like, to make this something special which becomes our culture in education. And I think, you know, the successful research I've done on that worked like that. The ones that were less successful were top down. I'm not saying that the ones that was frontline moving up was not, you know, supported by SLT. It was supported by the senior leadership team, but the teams were left to do it, and it moved up, but it sort of faltered up. Whereas the other way around seems to then create suspicion if it's a done to process. It's more of a work with than a done to.
Maybe we need more action research of people actually doing it in schools to show the benefits of it.
Absolutely. And then in addition to that, your question on coaching and mentoring and then governance, I had a really interesting conversation with Professor Ron Hill not so long ago, where we talked about governance induction, and again talked about how that needs to be considered as part of that governance journey, but also again that continuous toolkit to also grow future chairs and also vice chairs of governing boards, but also trustees, and what that piece could look like. And it's something we would like to explore in our governance and governing RIG as well in more depth. So watch this space, and I'm pretty certain I'll get in touch with you regarding that. But thanks for those questions, Tracy, and many, many congratulations on your huge
Oh,
achievement.
thank you very much. Thank you.
Brilliant. And then, Derek, anything you want to add?
Yeah, just I've been doing some work with the main schools in our partnership, and particularly I've been talking to not only the head teachers but also the HR directors within the schools and the trusts as well, seeing that an investment in mentoring and coaching and that supportive culture which you develop within the schools is very closely linked to retention of talent, not only of those who are coming into the organisation at the sort of the lower levels, but an investment in the value of mentoring and coaching of other people as perhaps as a role, or perhaps as to provide capacity on if there's a gap on somebody's timetable, don't fill it with something out of subject, perhaps give that as an opportunity to build capacity, and linking it very much to retention and also the organizational reputation as well, in terms of talent acquisition as well. Because if, unfortunately, in schools, you get to a point where if you've got a very static middle leadership, there aren't opportunities. You'll have people underneath. They need something in terms of growing their career. I came up through sort of a head of physics, head of electronics. I didn't want to go to head of science because I could see that it was vast majority of the work was nagging people, and particularly the schools I was working in. So I went advanced skills teacher, and then doing NQT induction, and then working vocational education, and went that way because I wanted to add capacity to the organisation. So I felt that if I supported the development of vocational education within the school, that gave an opportunity for them to build confidence in their own teams, to have that sort of ripple out effect. But that was a hard fought battle.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's interesting. We do have a people strategy in our trust, and some of that would come on about the retention and people training up people. But I'm just wondering if it could be built in more in terms of this coaching and mentoring and how that would work. Some questions to ask when I have my next governing meeting.
Interesting questions, aren't they? I mean, as I've illustrated in my own case, if there's a role that you can step into that's valued, I mean, that was the role I wanted, and I took with that another role because it came as a package, but loved it and never stopped learning about coaching and mentoring, to the point where I moved into teacher development and bigger roles later on, more senior roles. So I think it's about thinking about making this a permanent feature within schools as an actual role to enable teachers to apply for and know that there would be time. And if you go and look at the Carter Review, for example, or any of these reviews that's been done on initial teacher training, and if you look at Ofsted reports, as well as then I'm sure the early careers framework and MPQ reports eventually will also tell us that there's inconsistencies with the provision and the support, and one of the big reasons would be time and the lack of time. So we need to make a time commitment to ensure that people can sustain the role and also grow within that role. I think that's important. Tina.
Thanks again. I was just curious about a syndical piece. In observing what happened or what transpired here in New Brunswick, we had external mentors that would come in and support any teacher, early career or not. Sometimes school leaders would establish a mentorship sort of modeled in their building for new teachers coming in. So mentorship was kind of considered, it was a very palatable thing for folks. It was like you had a friend to kind of walk beside you as you were navigating and learning all that there is to learn about being an educator. And then I was in the system when they switched and they started using the term coaching. They provided some PL for the folks that were deemed coaches, but very little information was ever disseminated to the common classroom teacher. And it became quite controversial and resistance in some areas established really, really quickly, because according to our collective agreement, there's very defined times when a teacher can be supervised, or who can supervise a teacher. So we did have teachers that, you know, resisted their coaches and the whole concept because they felt that someone who was their equal was telling them what they had to do and had some connection to, if it wasn't the principal themselves, had a connection, and it wouldn't have been, but had a connection to the principal, who would then was charged with writing up the performance evaluation. So it got very mucky until it was sort of figured out, and I would say that it's never been figured out with clarity, but people have kind of just rolled with it and adapted their independent personal strategies so that they don't get into these controversial situations.
Hi,
So
Tina, can I just
my question was,
clarify?
is that an issue, I guess, for you, anyone else?
Can I just clarify? So in other
Mm.
words, have I understood correctly that the term coaching is used to then have conversations with staff, but also then to write it up and as part of a performance management approach? Am I right in thinking that?
Well, that's where it got sticky. So if I had a teacher that was experiencing difficulty, one of my strategies as a school leader would be to call in a coach. And then the coach would go in to provide support. Again, I don't feel that they received appropriate training, and I don't think that teachers understood the role well enough, and that just ends in resistance. We know that.
Yeah.
So, but then there was great concern about, I guess, the whole privacy thing of being coached and the reporting back to a school leader who was then charged with writing up that supervisory report or that performance evaluation. And that was never clearly defined. And it's one of the reasons why there was great resistance, in my opinion, great resistance to coaches.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to double check the terminology, because similar practices happen here in the UK. And I think that's why Peter was really clear. We need to be clearly clear on the definitions of coaching and mentoring. And if practices like that happen, I mean, if the coach needs to tell, if they need to direct, it's no longer coaching. We move into a mentoring sphere. And it sounds like the terminologies are and functions are used interchangeably, which again impacts on the relationship of trust, impacts on, you know, the ethical requirements of how you need to coach, because coaching is a non-directive voluntary engagement, and the coachee's journey is driven by the coachee, not through the direction of I would say the sponsor, because the coachee would be perceived as your client, so they are the coachee, they drive the journey. And then of course inevitably the reporting on that, which shouldn't really happen. But I know that if you work for a sponsor, there's a requirement of course of accountability, but that can be countered by an executive summary or an agreed, you know, summary of what needs to be shared. But there's so many ethical dilemmas and questions, and I'm not surprised that it is sticky and difficult, and that's often what happens in the UK. And that's why Derek and I are advocating that we need to see it as a toolkit of development and support, opposed to a performative measure, because otherwise we won't get away from the stigma that this is for people who are struggling or not performing well or not doing well. And I think that different conversations need to happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I would agree. I think that it really, here in New Brunswick, both mentoring and coach, well, not so much mentoring, but coaching for sure, sort of comes on the heels of some type of, it's data driven.
Yeah.
Whether it's quantitative or qualitative, it could be a teacher perception survey or a parent perception survey, or it's academic results that are measured through a standardized test somehow. So automatically it's an identified problem, rather than being something that's instituted because a person has a particular area of desire for growth, right? Like, I want to become this, so how can I get some coaching to support me on my professional journey? We don't do a good job at that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's about further conversations like this one to really explore that in more detail, and then thinking how we need to move forward with that and take action and address that more meaningfully. Derek, is there anything you want to add?
No, I think we covered that earlier on in terms of that performative, actual. Yeah, I'm going to ponder on that.
Stephanie.
Thank you. I'm really interested in what you're saying, Tina, and the work that I do with school leaders and having been a school leader myself as well, I think a lot of this comes from the inexact understanding of the terminology and the fact that coaching is used in sport in a very different way from the coaching definition that we're thinking about here. And so schools use the word coaching as a performative improvement tool rather than as something for growth and development, because you think about the way that you would coach somebody in sport. And I really think that that's the link. And when I do leadership programs with teachers here in the Northeast in England, getting that definition clear is you watch the light bulb go on, and you can see people thinking, oh, that's not how I've been thinking about coaching, and that's not what I've thought coaching was. And this conversation about it's used for people that are on capability or people who seem to be struggling and performing at a lower level than they should be is absolutely endemic across our school system. And there's an imperfect and often actually deeply inaccurate understanding of what coaching is. And I think it's because it's a word that's used in sport in a different way from the way that we're talking about it here. And so it's therefore not being used appropriately or accurately. And it links back to what the question that I asked earlier about the fact that people are also inexpert at doing it. The fact that Derek might be an expert physics teacher doesn't actually mean that he'd be a good mentor. He does need to understand the skills that good mentoring involves, because however good a teacher he is, articulating what it is that's working in the classroom is a really skillful thing. And training somebody new to come into the profession or developing somebody's expertise is a really highly skilled thing. I think that's really what was behind my question earlier, that I don't think we're very good at being clear about the fact that this is a deep skill, that you can't just grab it and go with it without having some serious training and doing some proper reading.
I completely agree, Stephanie. And I think that it's not only a deep skill, I think in some ways also it's almost reduced to people's understanding of just filling in paperwork, observing a lesson and giving feedback, but actually it's really honing in on that person and what they need at that point in time to ensure that they grow and develop and deepen their thinking. And with that, you also need to be well read on a wide range of things, not only your subject, but also your pedagogical underpinnings, your approach and philosophy in terms of education and also behavior management, etc. The list goes on. But I think you're right, it's very much a deep skill. And I think that schools need to value the expertise of the coach, the mentor, and what they bring to the table. But also, if they want really good coaches and mentors, to invest in that deep skill. Because if we don't do that, we will have shallow trainers in schools that would develop people in a really, really shallow way to not be able to cope with the demands of the role. And that's also how it will impact on retention. Because we know with the statistics we can look at, like, for example, the NQT survey, which is very old now, but what it states is that where mentoring is done really, really well, people had a brilliant experience and want to continue in the profession. Where it's done badly, people don't want to pursue this as a potential career pathway. So I think there's great value in investing in it and making sure that it moves on. Any other thoughts or observations before I move on? Yep. I can see a hand, and it is from South Africa, and I know because it's Professor Raj Mistry. Hello, Raj, welcome. I hope you can hear us. I know that they also have some issues.
Okay,
there you are. Hello.
Hi, good afternoon, good evening.
Nice to hear from you.
Thank you, Lizana. I just want to say that you've covered quite a number of issues. In fact, the questions that were raised as well explored quite depths of some of the issues around mentoring and coaching. But I want to then take you through, and I have heard someone from Iraq speaking as well, and I think we are in a similar kind of context. Now, in a South African context, many schools, and I say not some, many schools, are public schools that are staffed by people who themselves are inexperienced. Even your senior management teams and your heads of departments, your head teachers themselves have very little experience. They in fact, they are, for them to become mentors is really something that is going to be an unusual situation. But what I do agree that there are lots of cases of informal mentoring that takes place. We don't even talk about coaching. That's not heard of in a South African context. But I want to know now, having read, I haven't read your book, sorry, having written the book, how would you begin to advocate the issue of mentoring in a developing country like South Africa, where we need to change the education landscape? And perhaps I should just mention one thing here, not from a racial point of view, that many of the qualified teachers, experienced teachers, either retire or emigrate, or they stick in private schools or in affluent schools and are not prepared to move from those schools into the township schools or rural schools in South Africa.
A really good question, Raj. I'll disclose a little. I have a project, or had a Balmas funded project, which focused on head teacher development in South Africa, and that's also why I knew whose acronym that was. So I do work with Raj, who's from the University of Johannesburg, and one of the things we did through that project was I worked with a pilot. And we engaged with head teachers in schools via then online coaching and mentoring support. In addition to that, I have been in South Africa to then reach out to head teachers or aspirational head teachers and had some meetings with Raj with 32 head teachers who were really interested in the project. And the thinking around that is, of course, also to facilitate the development of those head teachers who might be retiring, to enable them to then give back in a sense that they could be consultants and also coach and mentor new head teachers into the role. Raj, I stand to be corrected, but my understanding is that you can become a head teacher within the first 3 years of your teaching. You only need to have 3 years teaching experience before you could step into the role in some cases. Am I right? In South Africa?
No,
Yeah.
you needed 7 years of teaching
7 years.
experience, but you could rise from a ordinary teacher to a head teacher. In other words, you didn't have to go through the steps of being a deputy head.
Okay.
That's right. So there are those situations because unions are involved in promotions as well. So
yes, of course.
we have this anomaly.
Because the one school told me, and I think it's in my notes, that it's 3 years, so it's 7 years. So I stand to be corrected, as I've said. And so you can just move straight into headship, which means you don't have to have a qualification in leadership development. You do not have to have any experience in running a school, which means that leaves you with a huge knowledge gap, but also experience gap. And we were looking at ways in which we can then utilize coaching and mentoring to provide that meaningful support, and also then to draw on the expertise of those colleagues who might be retiring. And it's a project we're currently still working on, and we've just put forward a bid for funding. So and again, we are also in talks with then local government to see how we can also think about developing the culture of coaching and mentoring within South Africa, because there is no such support, and if there is, it is few and far between. Anything else you want to add, Raj?
No, I think you've covered the essence of the issue that I raised. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you. Anyone else want to make an observation or ask a question?
I'll come in again, Lizana, and May here. I'm very interested in what Raj is saying, because I believe that, and I see Ines, as my colleague Ines has put it up in the chat, but you can become a principal in Ireland once you have 5 years experience, and you can actually become a principal sooner than that if there are less than 80 children in a school, And Ireland has a lot of schools, a lot of very small schools. But what mentoring has done, Raj, in that situation for us very practically, is that it has really supported people who are coming into principalship without prior knowledge and experience. And this is where it has been a very, very practical support for people in that position in particular. So, and it's why it's such a success story, but it equally works well for people who've done a lot of leadership professional learning and have had prior experience even outside of the educational sector. So the mentoring would be something that might work very well in your context as against the coaching, and the coaching coming along at a later stage, because it's something that I suppose looks at developing the potential of the person. The mentoring in Ireland, at least, is more focused on everyday practice and on the practical aspects of everyday practice. And so therefore lends itself very well to a context like yours, which is perhaps trying to begin mentoring and coaching within it. So I just wanted to say that and hope it's helpful. Thanks, Lizana.
Thanks for sharing, Anna-May. That's exactly how I worked on the pilot as well. It'd be lovely to compare notes if you're keen to look at the context and see how we can learn from each other and work with Raj on that, because I think it's such an important project in terms of social mobility and really making sure head teachers in South Africa have that confidence to lead well and effectively. And of course, it impacts then on the outcomes for children. So if you don't mind sharing your email address with me, I'll definitely get in touch, and hopefully, Raj, we can catch up with Anna-May as well on that. Anyone else? I can see Inez, you've turned your camera on. Do you want to share? Oh, my contribution, you just went on mute. I think you're still muted.
I'm sorry about that. I'm saying that it's a really interesting conversation. Thank you. And it's a really important one because it's very topical, I think, certainly in relation to Irish education. There's a whole new awareness around it, and I just want to support Anna-May and her organisation, IJA, around the great work that Anna-May and her colleagues are doing. And you know, in school leadership in Ireland, there's such appreciation for this support now, because for many years, school leaders felt a little bit abandoned and a little bit isolated, and so I think it's fantastic to receive both. I think they both have their place, and I think the mentoring is hugely important, as is the coaching. I think they have very, very distinct and separate roles, but I think equally important. But a big shout out to Anna-May, and if you do connect with her, you're connecting with a very good person.
I was just going to say in the chat, I'll put my email address in there if anyone wants to connect with us, because we certainly are only starting with our, we always feel we're starting with our work, even though we've done it all our lives. But I think, you know, it's such an important piece of work. So we'd love to collaborate and continue to work with anyone who wants to join us. So I'll just put my email address in the chat. And Derek, I don't know if there's anything you want to add.
No, I put my email address in earlier on, but in case it's been lost in the chat, I'll pop it in again. Happy to have a chat with anybody.
Super. Well, do we have any more contributions or comments or observations? No, it seems like everyone contributed and said what they needed to say, so that's really helpful. Derek, is there any final thoughts that you want? Are there any final thoughts that you want to share as a plenary and a last reflection?
I think a common theme which has come through this evening is about organisations finding the capacity and the value of a mentor or coach type role within their school or organisation. And I think if we can do that, then we can help and support that teacher agency or that agency of other professionals working with, so that they've got the opportunity to explore their roles in a safe space and their own conception of their own roles as well, and so that they can feel they've got that growth, and then they feel invested in, and then you help with the retention, the development of talent and welfare people that we work with in our organisations.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's capacity, but also what I'm hearing is that there are those tensions between the misconceptions of what the role is of coaching and mentoring, and also how can we move away from those and actually see it as a valuable tool that could contribute greatly to enable teachers and leaders, and also then enable us all to flourish and do what's right by the children and the communities we serve. And I think ultimately that's why it was important for us to produce this book, to open this kind of debate that we're having today, and to continue that conversation, because if we don't have that, we won't be able to move the needle in terms of cultural change, and that's what we're keen to see.
Yeah.
So I just want to then, last but not least, thank Deb, because I know that she also spins many plates as the chair of the organisation for helping us to then present today. And thank you to Nick for organising the event too. And I'm going to say then thanks to everyone for attending, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the evening, and we look forward to hearing from you and working with you in future.
Indeed. Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lizana.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Really
you.
interesting.
Thanks
Thank
very
you.
much. It was lovely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.